Welcome to the Mystical Mermaid Lounge podcast, a space where all spiritual seekers are honored and celebrated. This podcast was born from the journeys of your hosts, who have each faced her own dark night of the soul, but they've emerged with an unshakable belief in divine connection, cosmic inspiration, and her true life's calling. Join us on a journey of personal growth, transformation, and magical self-discovery. Your first co-host is Chloe Brown, a gifted intuitive empath and shadow work life coach. Your second co-host is Keone Starr, an intuitive energy worker and acclaimed past life regressionist. The Mystical Mermaid Lounge podcast starts now.
Well, welcome. We have Maria today with us, and she grew up in a border region and is a talented author. She has a dog named
Chunchies
and two cats, Binks and Salem. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm so excited.
Thank you, Maria. So happy to have you. I am Keone.
I am Chloe. So please, if you wouldn't mind, give us an evolution of your childhood religions and or belief systems, kind of what that looks like for you.
Yeah, so I grew up, I'm Mexican, and I grew up in a Catholic household. I'm a first generation American, meaning that my family migrated with me, although I was born in the US, so kind of that's a very border kid experience, I think. But we grew up Catholic. Although I would say that my immediate household, which was like my mom, her twin sister, and my grandparents, they weren't super traditional Catholic in that we weren't necessarily in church every single Sunday. If we missed a Sunday, it wasn't the end of the world, which for other Catholics it might be. And we had a deep connection to the Virgen de Guadalupe. I think that came from my grandmother. And the Virgen de Guadalupe, as I've gotten older, I've learned is a mix of indigenous Mexican, specifically Mexica goddess Tonantzin, and then the Spanish and the colonization that happens. And so she's actually a reclaiming of the indigenous roots of Mexico. So again, I've learned that as I've gotten older, and she's someone who now I see as my spirit guide, but very much from the feminist, indigenous perspective, I guess. My mom's a character, and she would always buy me like witchy books in Spanish. Spanish is my first language, so that was what I was reading. She'd get me like, I don't even know where she would find them, but these like cool books on like herbs and witchy characters. And she would always let me watch witchy movies. Like I grew up with Kiki's Delivery Service and Mary Poppins, who to me is also witchy, you know?
Absolutely.
And I think I love Mary Poppins. So I think my mom kind of just let me be. And I don't remember a lot of my childhood, but as an adult, I've recovered it. And I am starting to remember that. Like I loved dressing up as a little witch. I loved pretending I was doing spells. So I think it was always a part of me, and it was never shunned by my family. So, of course, teenage phase, I didn't want to be Catholic anymore. Did I believe in God, etc.? Still going through that a little bit, but now as an adult, I think I've kind of blended the cultural part of being Catholic, which to me is like being with your family, the Virgen for sure, and then the part for me, which is my spirituality, is definitely more on the healer side. I'm still trying to figure it out, but definitely more spiritual than what you would say religious.
Definitely. Having lived in San Diego and Houston for a while, I kind of see it as like a little diagram, and there's, let's say there's Catholicism here, and then here's, spirituality or witchcraft or paganism, and the middle ground between those two specifically for me has always been beautifully intriguing. So I am so excited to have you here today.
I think, like I said, I'm in spaces where it's embraced. It's very normal. Like I'm not going against the grain in any way. And I think it speaks to what you're saying. Border communities definitely have more of that third space where things mix like that.
What more specifically about this path feels different to you than the form of Catholicism that you were raised with?
I think the church in general always, not that it scared me, but it felt very restrictive. And I think even when I was a kid, I didn't understand, and maybe I'm just understanding it wrong, but I think I've gone to church enough to understand the narrative that no matter what you do, you're going to be punished. I don't get it. I've never understood it. I grew up in what I would say a feminist household. I grew up with my single mom, but she had her twin sister, and my grandma and my mom's were both very much like the matriarchs. So I didn't also understand that it was all about the father, the priest. And so I just kind of started to try to find other sources of, I guess, power, where it doesn't feel like I have to give up my power as a woman, but also as a woman of color, and where it doesn't feel performative. Okay, if I do all these things, then I get to go to heaven, but I see people who are doing all these things by the book, and then they're crappy people in the everyday life. I don't get it. So I think that that's what happened. Yeah. And I think just reading more about different, not just witchcraft, not just paganism or curanderismo or Mexican healers, but also yoga. I practice a lot of yoga. So also doing some of those readings was just like kind of okay, I can take a step back and I can practice the spirituality that works for me. And it's really about like my relationship to that higher power than like my relationship to an institution.
I love that. Beautifully said.
I understand the cultural mix of having Catholicism and then your own traditional beliefs. I totally get that. But why do you think that your mom was even more open than that? That she would even give you witchy books or things that had to do with medicinal herbs, where in some cultures, not necessarily yours, but in other cultures that are heavily Catholic, that would be very looked down upon.
Yep. And I think I'm discovering this as of a week or two ago. I mean, I think I always knew this, but it's becoming more clear. I think in a family that's maybe middle class, upper class, definitely, the wealthy Mexicanos who maybe have a closer affinity to their European roots, I can see how it's like super shunned to do anything else besides Catholicism. But my family they say they grew up poor but very happy, and I can see that. Like I've learned a lot of their stories. But they grew up in a pueblo, they grew up in a rancho, like my mom was born in the rancho house. They didn't have electricity for a long time, and she tells me all these stories. And so I think I'm discovering that my great-grandparents, and probably as we get deeper into those ancestors, were very tied to their indigenous practices as opposed to the Catholic practices, or they mixed them pretty well. So my grandpa's mom was a curandera, and she delivered my mom and all of my grandma's kids. I grew up with los remedios, or the remedies. We trust each other's medicine first, like the herbs we drink in tea. I guess what I grew up knowing like as rancho remedies, right? Before going to the doctor. So I think that also speaks to like why she would let me read these witchy books, embrace some of those witchy practices. I don't think she ever saw it as a bad thing.
I'm starting to see that when people have money, it seems to strip some of their identity from them. And when I say strip the identity, I mean the indigenous parts of us. My mom's Native American. She grew up on the res. And we were raised with those types of ideologies and respecting the earth, respecting the sun. And the earth gives life. That is your creator. And I'm just starting to see this thread that the more financially better off people get, the less they rely on our cultural background.
No, I don't know the answer to that, but it makes me think a couple things. If, for example, just speaking from my family's perspective, if they didn't have the means to go to a hospital, or to even get to the nearby pueblo, then they had to rely on like the community wisdom, which to me is generational wealth of information of how to come up with remedies or come up with whatever it is to survive. And I also think they had a relationship to the land very similar to what you're speaking. I would say they wouldn't talk about it the same way, but like my grandpa raised his own crops my entire life, like up until I was born, and up until he passed, like he depended on the land to feed our family. So I think that relationship was there.
Is it possible the English language just doesn't have enough to be able to describe these? So we're always trying to fit them into these, labels that don't quite fit through different cultures and different indigenous lifestyles or languages. And it almost feels like that's actually what I just heard you say is, to them that was their religion. And here I could try to label it as witchcraft, but for you and your family, it really authentically feels like this is their Catholicism. This is how they were Catholic. This is how they had their interactions with their God, and their God was in the form of this religion, but not the institutionalized financial transactional version of such.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that's why the Virgen de Guadalupe is so big. And I think if you talk to anyone, any Mexican Catholic from humble beginnings, the Virgen de Guadalupe will also probably be a major part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's what it is. It's a more spiritual relationship than what Chloe just said, a transactional one or performative, like you said.
I mean, even like Dia de los Muertos, right? Which to me is very accepted by mainstream society in general, even in the US now. Like that's not a Catholic practice. That's an indigenous practice of like connecting back to your ancestors, and setting up an altar and having the cempasúchil, the flowers that then lead them to, so.
What's your thoughts on somebody who perhaps feels connected with your culture, but did not grow up in that culture, perhaps?
I mean, that's a hard question. Do you mean like they practice or appropriate, or what's the line? And I think that is the question, right?
Nailed it. Yes. Thank you so much, Maria. You took the words right out of my mouth.
Something I've learned mostly from the yoga readings, actually, is that there's a sort of absolute truth in the world. And, my fiance is a yoga teacher of 20 years, so he's going to lecture me if I don't explain this right. But let's just say there's an absolute truth, right? I think there are teachings and beliefs across cultures, across religions that are absolute truths, like the land is sacred, right? And so I think that if we're all, or even Dia de los Muertos, right? I mean, we call it Dia de los Muertos, but I've seen it in different forms across the world, right? Honoring your dead or still maintaining that relationship with ancestors. And so I think that that's actually really important because it helps us see that at bottom line, like we're all connected, I do think, of course, if there's like a complete disregard for my histories and culture and someone's just coming in and kind of appropriating them, whether it's like dressing up like a Mexican for Halloween or just, I have a super problem with people using Frida Kahlo's image everywhere. So something like that, then I think that's more, if there's no respect and honor for what it is, then I think I have a problem with it.
Integrity and intention seems to be the bottom line.
And I agree with that. And I think that that's exactly why I struggle with Frida being so commercialized, because there's no intention. And she would have hated it, and like if you know anything about her, you would know she would just not be about the commercialization of her image.
I agree. Frida, obviously I didn't know her personally, but reading and seeing everything I could about her life and having her paintings in my home, yes, she was not about that.
I've heard you have perhaps a close connection with animals. Could you speak to that a little bit? I would love to hear this. I am an animal lover.
Yes, I think it's so funny when Keone asked me to be a part of this podcast and she pitched me the theme, and it's all about my connection to animals. It was so interesting to me because I think anyone who knows me in like my day-to-day life knows I'm obsessed with animals, as my cat's tail is on the camera. But
oh my gosh, that is great. Just as you were saying that, it's all we could see is this beautiful tail.
They're sleeping on top of my desk, and then my dog is somewhere around here too. But I am a super animal lover, and I think a lot of us are, but I would say that I have definitely a spiritual connection to animals. not just the ones that I have here. I mean, I can't even get myself to call them my pets because they don't feel like my pets. But also animals I've met like on travel, when I was traveling, or other people's animals, and just in general, like the crows that live outside my house. So I think it's really interesting that you all picked up on that, even though we haven't like met in person or you haven't met my dog or anything like that. So yeah.
I love that. I know Chiani also is a big animal person, and I think we spend so much time trying to be productive and be that, good employee, that good partner in life, and that good friend. And having that reminder sometimes to stop and smell the roses and really, truly, for me, it's watch the wildlife. And I think both of you know, I have a little bit of a commute to my 9 to 5 job every day, and it's about an hour one way. And I will intentionally take, the little bit of a longer route just so that I could see the wildlife. Having somebody else who understands that, I think, is beautiful. And what I'd like to understand specifically for you is, how does that tie in with your belief system, and what does it look like for you? If my husband would allow it, I would probably have the whole farm and all of the animal shelters at my home, and they would all be no kill. So where's that balance, and how do you live with this, and what does that look like for you?
That's a great question. I think on a very practical level, it's taking care of my immediate surroundings, meaning I know there's crows that come and hang out by my house. So now I feed them and I love them, and they come visit me. I think from a deeper perspective, I feel like all of my dogs and cats now have come to me through very spiritual ways. When I got my dog, Chonchis, who to me is like my familiar, and she's my like soul dog, right? I was looking for a dog, but the day before I found her, I talked to my grandma, who had already passed, and I said, if it's meant to be, like, tomorrow's my last day looking for a dog. If it's not meant to be, I won't find one, and that's it, right? And sure enough, the next day, Chonchis was at the rescue, and someone was about to pick her up, so they're like, you can come by, but I can't guarantee she'll be here. And she ended up being there, even though someone went to go look at her, and I ended up getting her. Same thing with Cash, my dog who passed away. Same thing with the cats. The cats even more, because Cash passed away in June. And then I'd never had cats. I never thought I would have cats. I liked them, but they were kind of an enigma to me. I just didn't know enough about cats. And
Oh, I get it.
and then a month after he passed, there's this mom cat that's pregnant hanging out at my mom's workplace in the parking lot. All the workers are like, you have to save her. And I'm like, okay, fine. So it was like spur of the moment, I saved this cat. What do they call it? Like the cat distribution system finally found me. She is a black and white, I guess, tuxedo cat. She's super cute. My mom kept her. I've always wanted a black cat, and for some reason, she gave birth to a boy and a girl black cat. And so now that's what I have. And to me, that's like not chance. That's higher power working, And now they, especially the girl cat, will be around me. If I'm doing anything at my altar, she's with me. So it's interesting. They're only about 6 months, 7 months. So I'm excited to see how that develops as they get older and like as I get deeper into my practice. But
Absolutely relate to all of that. I was definitely a dog person. I had a stray cat once that chose me, and mentally I named him and gave him all of the things. And then I was like, oh, maybe he's cold outside. He needs to come in. And he was like, no. So he was the outdoor. He chose me cat. So I never really fully claimed him because I didn't have that full cat experience. And then my baby passed away after 9.5 years, which is more than I expected to get because of his breed. And I don't know that I've truly actually fully got over that yet. It's been almost 3 years, in a couple weeks actually. And so I ended up with my cat because of his space capacity. Why would I get a cat? And let me tell you, that has been the most amazing experience. Fun fact though, I actually thought she was a black cat. When I went to pick her up, she was a tuxedo. You'd mentioned that you believe your puppers was your familiar. Could you speak to that a little more?
yeah, I mean, my understanding of a familiar, and you all can help me with this, but my understanding is that they're like your spirit guide in animal form. And usually they come in the shape of a cat from what I've read, but she's definitely my familiar. And I say that because we're so in tune with each other, it's not normal. I think even my friends who have their own dogs are very just baffled. She mirrors my energy. So, for example, I had a really difficult moment a few years ago where I had to leave her with my friend and I had to go take care of this, and it was deeply traumatic. I wasn't sure if I was going to be okay. So I was away taking care of that, and I resolved everything, and then I knew I was going to be okay. And right at that moment, my friend texted me a picture of Chunchi's. She was sleeping and she said, she hasn't relaxed all day until now, so something good must have happened on your end. So that's a really perfect example. I was like 2 hours away from her, and she felt it and calmed down. She knows if something's wrong with me, but also I know exactly what she needs and she knows exactly what I need. I've never had that connection with any other animal, even though I've had other animals, like with Cash, for example, my dog. He very much felt like my dog, right? Obviously, I love him. I still hurt over him, but he wasn't my familiar the way that Chunchi is.
So do you think the animals have souls?
I do. I do, and I don't care if there's nothing to back this up, although I'm convinced there is some kind of readings. I'm a scholar, so I'm all about the footnotes, right? Like I've been trained to figure out my footnotes and back up my arguments, but I think so. And I think like maybe they don't always come back as animals, right? Like I do believe in having multiple lives, but I do think like, for example, Chonchi and I, like our connection is there in every lifetime. Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the things that I have heard in spiritual communities is that we evolved spiritually from animals. I'm not sure that's true, considering how well animals seem to take care of each other and us. I'm thinking maybe in many cases we evolve to them.
Yeah, I love that. It kind of makes me think of Avatar, The Last Airbender. Is anyone familiar with that cartoon? Momo and Appa and all the animals in that show are very in tune with the humans, but then I also think there's a part in the series where the spirits are in the form of animals and they're like the wise, almost like the wise elders. So I can see that. I agree with that.
What do you think the purpose of the animal's soul and existence is?
I'm a believer that the earth isn't for just humans. If anything, we're a very small part of it. I don't necessarily think the purpose of the soul of an animal is for our well-being. I think it's like in general, they take care of each other. Keone said they take care of the land, right? In different ways.
Where do you believe that they go after they pass away?
No, I don't know. When I encountered Cash, he was at the beach. So I think maybe they just go to their favorite place. I encountered Cash in a meditation and he showed up and he was at the beach, which again, he's my dog that passed away back last summer, but I don't know. Sometimes I think there's almost another dimension and they're still around us, just in a different plane. Sometimes I picture it the way Coco depicts it, which of course is very Disney-fied, but it's also fun, I do believe in alebrijes, which are the spirit protectors in animal form. Or in a hybrid animal form, they're like these art pieces that Mexican artists started making in the 1930s, 20s, around that era. I don't know where they go, but I hope they stay with us a little bit. Or I hope we get to see them again.
My thoughts exactly. My thoughts exactly. I just want to hang out. I don't care where we are. Well, since we're on this conversation, why do you think there is animal cruelty?
That is such a hard question for me because I obviously struggle with animal cruelty. It'll destabilize me for days or weeks or even months if I learn about something. I've had to really clean up my algorithm so that nothing comes up. If I'm watching a movie, I go on the website doesthedogdie.com that will tell you everything and anything that happens to animals in movies. And actually it gives you all the trigger warnings, but I look at it for animal purposes. So why there's animal cruelty? I am a little jaded. I am a historian. My day-to-day work is to read about really awful things that humans do to control others on the basis of race or gender. And so it doesn't surprise me that there's animal cruelty, but I also do believe that there's people who are just cruel and evil. And unfortunately, I'm trying to really work against this belief I have, but I don't believe most humans. I can't say that. I know there's like really good humans, and I know the majority of humans hopefully are great people, but I do think there's also a large chunk of us who are just plain evil and like have no sense of remorse or morality or passion, right? And so I think for me, hurting an animal is one of the worst things you can do because they're so innocent. Or maybe innocent's not the right word, but they'll love you. Their first choice is to love you or at least respect you, right? They're not going to go out of their way to try to hurt you unless you're hurting them. And so to me, someone who commits animal cruelty, that's one of the worst things you can do. Just hurting anyone whose power is uneven to you, because you know that, right? There are people who are evil or maybe are broken enough and have just become that way, right? Maybe that's why there's animal cruelty, but I also have felt so disheartened in trying to find the answer or trying to fix it. And I've tried to just reframe it. So instead of trying to like wrap my mind around why it happens, I donate to causes. I donate to a specific cause in California that helps people who don't have houses, so people who live unhoused on the streets and have pets, and so they give them resources. I can't control how awful people are to animals, but I can give it to this organization who's helping people and their pets have more of a life that's livable and well, right? So,
Wow. There was a time in my life where I had just left a very domestic violent situation. And I'm pretty sure I took up an outfit for work for the next day and my dog, and that was it. And there was not any resources. There was not any communities. Even the battered women's shelters absolutely denied even putting me on the list because I had a dog. And it broke my heart because I didn't understand how they didn't understand that for me, that is what was keeping me alive. So that really touched my soul. I love that there's those organizations, and perhaps maybe we can bring awareness and more of those types of organizations. I love that.
You know, it's interesting you say that, Chloe and Maria as well, because number one, people are cruel for a variety of reasons, but cruelty toward the unhoused is off the charts. In Baltimore, several years ago, they were setting homeless on fire, which shows an absolute disregard, which I think does go back to some sense of European, especially I'm thinking of the English, where they used to jail you for being in debt, right? Being in poverty was considered a character flaw, right? So the lords, the ladies, the people of royalty that had money or old money or status were considered higher class, and if you had to work for a living, then you weren't equal. So there's a part of this poverty thread I find that still runs through our fabric of our culture in this country, so that if you're unhoused, you're lazy. If you're in debt, there's COVID kind of leveled that playing field a bit as far as indebtedness being a character flaw. But if you are in debt or have financial problems, you have no self-control. I mean, there's all of these narratives that run around terrible situations that people can be in for any number of reasons. So I look at that and I think about people who are unhoused, living on the street or in tents, and they have their animals and maybe a shopping cart. That is the whole of what they have. And I understand the thought that, well, you can't even take care of yourself. Why are you trying to take care of a dog? Why are you trying to take care of a cat? I get that on a logical level. But to both of your points, an animal is not a logical addition to one's life. It's not a thing. It would be as if saying, well, you can't afford your child right now, get rid of it, right? At least to me. And so the fact that there are organizations out there that allow us to help keep a living organism that has a spirit, I agree with you, Maria, that has a spirit, that has a soul, who my mom always said that, especially for domesticated animals, that they're here to bring us pure joy. That's their purpose. And so why would you take that away from someone? And I don't know, maybe you can answer this question, Maria, being an historian, being an author, looking into gender, race as people being victimized for those reasons. Why do we feel the need to dominate other people? Is it fear? Is it coming to the world with a fear of lack? What you have means I don't?
This is the question I always get from my students, right? And I think some of them answer it themselves. And of course, I don't know the right or wrong answer, but if I'm speaking from historical terms, I think there's a disregard for life because there has to be dehumanization, right? So I think for me, it all stems from colonization, and not just the British, but also the Spanish and the Dutch and just any colonial power that entered the Americas or even other parts of the world. It's not exclusive to the United States, right? In order to subjugate the people they found when they arrived, they had to dehumanize them. And then in order to create wealth through the institution of slavery, they also had to dehumanize Africans, right? And so people are no longer seen as people. They're definitely not seen as equals, but they're seen as property or as objects to remove, right? Objects to remove so that the land can be resettled. And I think that those logics are still present today. And yes, maybe they're not as clear, maybe they're not as obvious, although I think they are, right? If you look, it's there. And if you just start to piece it back to colonization, you can trace it all the way back, whether it's the logics of racial hierarchy or the logics of criminalizing certain groups or land removal, whatever it is. And so I think that if our society has those logics in place of like certain people are property, there's a disregard for life, certain people, certain races or certain classes or genders should not have access to basic human dignity, then it's easier to do things to them, whether it's burn their tents or remove their dog or incarcerate them. I think I'm speaking very much like the ethnic studies scholar that I am by saying like the problem is we need to decolonize or we need to like reframe our relationships, but I do think there's truth to that.
Yeah, I agree. And it makes sense. And there's a part of me that wonders if they weren't already dehumanized because they were other to begin with.
Absolutely, right? And that's the core of it. And so the other, right, or the question of the other, like who the other is, changes over time or it changes over context, but it's always someone who's not the white man, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And, you know, my mom is no Catholicism scholar, having been victim, honestly, to being put into a Catholic school as an Indigenous child and being forced to embrace that religion and let go a lot of the cultural history that she had. She noticed over time that whether it's through the church or just in general, but I think a lot of it is through the church. She noticed that the affinity towards animals kind of changed around St. Francis of Assisi, where people were being, very cruel to animals because they were livestock. They did, right? Just to your point, they were clearing the land, they were hauling our goods, they had a job, a purpose, and that was to serve. You said adogdied.com is the website where we can look up. How about kills me to see people beating on horses in some of these movies where they're trying to get them out of a ditch. It's like, you pull something out of a ditch, attach 400 pounds to your back and try to pull out of a ditch and keep beating on me. But I digress. The thing is, she said that before St. Francis of Assisi, and I don't know if it was because of St. Francis or just because of a shift in thought around animals, they just weren't considered worthy of anyone's attention.
Yeah. And it makes me think of like not specific to the Catholic Church, but specific to animals being either just things that are in the way or labor, the massacre of the bison in the 19th century. That one blows my mind because to me it's just so much violence, right? And no regard for the consequences of that violence, like decomposing bodies, like from a very logical perspective, but also just from a spiritual perspective of how much damage you are doing, not just to the earth and to the animal themselves, but yourself. I also feel this way about deforestation and just anything that's hurtful.
It was interesting, and it's along that line. I was in Yellowstone not too long ago, and I fell in love with the bison. And I knew because my mom had shared the history that the colonizers and the settlers had killed the bison specifically to starve indigenous people and to push them off of specific lands where they had hunted respectfully the bison and used obviously as a grateful food source. And so I'm in Yellowstone, and I can't help but feel two overwhelming feelings. One was horrendous, oppressive sorrow on that traumatic area, and a amazing, miraculous sense of abundance because the bison in Yellowstone are now around 5,000 because there were people who, despite their being of settler lines, saw the importance of having bison, not just for people, but for the ecological system that was totally disrupted across the country because of the killing. And the last thing I'll say about that, when I was at the Montana Museum, I think it was Montana University of Montana Museum, I can't remember, Montana State, and there was a wing that spoke to some of the indigenous tribes in the Yellowstone area. And the summary of what happened to the bison on one wall read like this: the bison disappeared around the time period of X to X. And I'm reading this, and I have my mom chirping in my ear all while we were growing up at what exactly happened to the bison, right? And then I turned to another wall that it must have been updated most recently that said that the settlers had destroyed the bison population. And it did not even start to come back until X period of time. Specifically, breeding pairs were brought onto Yellowstone in a protected territory in order to restore that herd. And maybe I thought as I'm reading this, and our guide was so eloquently describing that process too, that was the miraculous abundance that one could feel from the very bison themselves.
I love that. And I think you said something in the middle of all that where even though people were of settler descent, they helped repopulate the bison population. And I think that's important, right? Students are always, how do we move forward? We're not going to completely decolonize, right? This is our context. We have to just bring everyone in and reframe some of the way we think about things, reconnect with each other, and have respect and love for everyone, including the animals and the land, right? And each other across differences. So, yeah.
Thank you. I love that. And our guide was so wonderful through Yellowstone. She said, I can't help, and she had tears in her eyes. She said, I just can't help feel like this is my fault because my ancestors are of Scottish Irish descent. And I said, okay, we all come from somewhere. We can all sit around and cry and feel horrible about this. But I love what you just said. Why not reframe and let's start seeing the divine spark in all of us and move forward.
Definitely. do you think that creating those foul, harmful events, do you think that that necessarily is what damages their soul? Or do you think that they came into this world with a damaged soul? And to tie it back to the animals, is it making more damaged souls by creating the harm? Or did you come in as a damaged soul and the byproduct being creating harm? I'd just love to hear your thoughts on that.
And that sounds like a chicken or the egg question.
It's
Exactly
that
it.
thing that someone told me the other day, hurt people hurt people.
Yes, I've
Hurt
heard that
people
one
hurt
before.
animals. Yeah.
It's true.
Mhm. I mean, I think there's definitely that where, like, I think it's everything you said. Like, I think everything you said is true. I think there's people who come into life this way, whether it's because in previous lifetimes they've done harm or harm's been done to them. I don't know. And then I think there's people that learn it. So I'm thinking specifically of like maybe children who go through abuse and then
Yeah.
end up turning to animals. So yeah, I think it's everything. And I will say in my lifetime, I've met maybe one or two people who are just plain cruel and I can't necessarily wrap my mind around them. And I think that might be a whole other category, right? I can't explain why they're like that, but I do think there's that too. And I think the other part that maybe we haven't mentioned, if someone's hurting an animal, they're likely to hurt other people. If someone's like, oh, the person is like messing with this hamster, ha ha ha. Like, no, that hamster's still a living creature. Like, it's not funny just because it's a smaller animal. But also, if they're willing to hurt something as defenseless as a hamster, what do you think they'll do with other people or kids? To me, that's a flag.
Exactly. To me, that's a huge red flag. We've all seen that Netflix series.
I have not because I can't stomach it.
So I'm very similar to you. If I hear somebody cried because potentially the animal got hurt, oh, I just can't cope. There's a lot I don't watch because of that. So it took me a long while, but everybody was like, no, I think the whole purpose of that show was really made for folks like us. It's not about what the title specifically blatantly calls it, because that's why I was terrified to watch it. But it's about crime sleuths seeing this video online. They're doing that to a cat. What are they going to do to humans? And they took it that seriously, and they were trying to raise awareness on that exact same thing that you just spoke of. Maybe you don't care that it's a cat society, but I do, because where's the line?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what the whole thing's about.
Can any of you watch the SPCA commercials or the Humane Society commercials where the poor dog is sitting outside in the freezing cold with the snow?
No, ignorance is bliss, but I'll put my money where my mouth is, or my resources, or my energy, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Good. I'm glad to know. My husband said, Leslie, it's reality. You have to watch it. And I said, I'm really aware it's reality and I don't need to watch it.
So my fiance knows, the kids know, and they're very supportive. They'll let me look it up on Does a Dog Die? They'll make sure I don't watch anything. But we went to go watch Guardians of the Galaxy 3. And if you're familiar with Guardians of the Galaxy, they have a raccoon. He has tech in his body. He's super smart. It's kind of like a computer. And raccoons are my favorite animal. And the very opening scene for Guardians of the Galaxy 3 is baby raccoon being taken out of the lab because they're going to experiment on him. So the whole movie's about that. And that first scene, my fiance just looks at me and he's like, I'm so sorry. I didn't know it was going to be like this. But, I mean, I cried the entire time, but I think I was very happy that such a popular film was about animal cruelty in that way. Because, of course, like, animal testing still happens. And a lot of people completely don't even know about it, so.
Yeah. Is it possible that you rescue animals?
I wouldn't say I rescue animals because I have a cousin who like actively goes and tries to help see if there's animals who need rescue, so I don't do that. But if I encounter an animal that needs help, of course I'll try to rescue them or call someone. Although all my pets, I hate that I call them pets, all my cats and dogs that I have been rescues. So I'm a firm believer in like adopt, don't shop, or the cats in this case, or their mom was on the street and she was pregnant and so we brought her in. Yeah.
I love that. Wanted to see if you by chance had brought either an affirmation or an invocation, or if anything throughout this resonated with you that you would like to leave for our listeners?
I love that. Lead with love, and the love you put out there, not just for humans, but for any living creature or the earth or plants or anything. We're pouring into this bigger love flow, and like it all comes back to us, right? So lead with
Yeah.
love.
I love that. That's so good. Thank you so much for being here. It was such a pleasure, Maria. I hope we can have you back again. It was just so wonderful chatting with you. I could chat with you forever.
Yes, this was so awesome. And I'll just plug crueltyfreekitty.com. That's where you can find all products that are cruelty free. So I've used them for years, and I basically shop everything cruelty free. So I wanted to plug that in. But thank you all for having me. It was great.
Thank you so much, Maria. I am so thankful that you shared your light and your thoughts with us. I am a better person because of it.
Thank you for joining the Mystical Mermaid Lounge podcast. Constructive and positive feedback are always welcome. Drop us some fan mail at mysticalmermaidlounge@buzzsprout.com or email us directly at mysticalmermaidlounge@yahoo.com. Finally, we do not accept sponsorships or ads so that we may bring a less distracting message to our listeners. So, if you are just as passionate as we are about educating and supporting spiritual seekers, then please brew some tea or Joe and pour us a cup at buymeacoffee.com/Mystical Mermaid Lounge. Thanks again, and catch us at the next high tide. Bye-bye.